The morning of August 15th, 1945, brought an eerie silence to the compound outside Seoul that would forever change the lives of 12 women who had forgotten what freedom meant. For the first time in months, no orders echoed through the wooden barracks. No boots marched across the courtyard. The Imperial Japanese flag that had fluttered above the main building lay crumpled in the dirt, abandoned like the women who had suffered beneath its shadow. Mi-young pressed her face against the crack in the wooden wall, her dark eyes scanning the empty yard with the wariness of a hunted animal. At 19, she looked much older, her once round cheeks now hollow, her hair cropped short and unkempt, her hands bearing scars that told stories she wished she could forget. 2 years in this place had taught her to read danger in every sound, to find safety only in silence, and to expect nothing but cruelty from the world. "They're gone," whispered Hana from the corner, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. The older Korean woman had been here longer than any of them, her spirit worn thin by endless months of horror that had stripped away everything she once believed about human nature. At 24, she had become the unofficial mother to the younger women, teaching them how to survive when survival seemed impossible. Through the thin walls, they could hear Akiko pacing in the overseer's quarters, her footsteps betraying an anxiety that matched their own. The Japanese woman had managed this facility for over a year, caught between her duty to the Imperial Army and the growing weight of what she witnessed daily. She had told herself she was just following orders, but the faces of the women haunted her dreams, and today even she seemed lost in the uncertainty of what would come next. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the morning quiet like thunder in a clear sky. Mi-young's heart hammered against her ribs as she peered through the crack, expecting to see the familiar Japanese military trucks that brought new horrors. But these vehicles were different, larger, painted in unfamiliar colors, with strange markings on their sides that she couldn't read. Foreign soldiers emerged from these vehicles, speaking in a language she didn't recognize, moving with a confidence that spoke of victory. American soldiers. The women had heard whispers of Japan's surrender filtering through the compound like smoke, but none dared believe it. Hope had been beaten out of them too thoroughly, too systematically. Now, watching foreign soldiers dismount from their vehicles, reality began to sink in with all the weight of a stone dropped into still water. But with it came a new terror. What would these new conquerors demand of them? What fresh hell awaited them under different flags? Sergeant James Mitchell stepped down from the lead jeep, his boots crunching on the gravel with the sound of authority. At 26, the Ohio farm boy had seen his share of war across the Pacific, had witnessed the aftermath of battles and the cost of victory, but nothing in his experience had prepared him for what he was about to discover. His orders were simple and routine. Inspect all facilities in the sector, document any military assets, and ensure civilian safety. It should have been a straightforward assignment. The compound looked innocuous enough from the outside, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by a fence not unlike the farm compounds he'd grown up around back home. But something felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. The silence was too complete, too fearful. There was an absence of normal human activity that set his nerves on edge, a quality to the quiet that spoke of people hiding rather than people absent. "Sergeant," called Private Rodriguez from near the main building, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "You need to see this." Mitchell approached the building Rodriguez was examining, noting the bars on the windows that seemed designed to keep people in rather than out. Through a window, he caught a glimpse of movement, figures huddled in the shadows, watching them with wide, terrified eyes that reflected a fear so deep it seemed to have settled into their bones. "Hello?" Mitchell called out in his limited Japanese, the words feeling clumsy on his tongue. "We're American soldiers. You're safe now." The response was immediate and heartbreaking. A collective gasp, followed by the sound of bodies pressing against the far wall, the rustle of fabric as women tried to make themselves invisible. These weren't soldiers or officials. These were women, and they were more terrified of rescue than they had been of abandonment. It took 3 hours and the arrival of Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese-American interpreter whose own family had suffered in American internment camps, before the full scope of what they'd found became clear. The women, 12 in total, mostly Korean with 2 Chinese, had been forced into sexual slavery by the Imperial Japanese Army as part of a systematic program that stretched across occupied Asia. Mitchell felt his stomach turn as Hiroshi translated the women's halting explanations, their voices shaking with the effort of speaking about unspeakable things. This wasn't just a military brothel. It was a systematic operation of kidnapping, coercion, and abuse that had operated under official sanction, with paperwork and procedures and the cold efficiency of bureaucracy applied to human suffering. "They think we're here to use them," Hiroshi said quietly, his own voice shaking as he struggled to maintain professional composure. "They're asking what we want them to do first. They're trying to figure out our preferences." The young sergeant looked at the faces peering at him from the doorway, faces that expected the worst, because the worst was all they had known, faces that had learned to survive by anticipating pain and preparing for degradation. Some were barely older than his sister back home, children forced into adult horrors that no one should ever have to endure. "Tell them," Mitchell said slowly, his voice thick with emotion he was trying to control, "that we're not here to hurt them. Tell them they're free. Tell them no one will ever hurt them again." But even as Hiroshi translated, Mitchell could see the disbelief in their eyes, the way they glanced at each other as if sharing a private joke about the naivety of their liberators. Freedom was a concept they'd forgotten, a word that had lost all meaning in the face of daily reality. The first act of kindness came from Private Rodriguez, who offered his field rations to a woman who looked ready to collapse from hunger. Maria Santos, barely 18, stared at the food for a long moment, then at his face, searching for the catch, the demand that would follow, the price she would be expected to pay. When none came, when he simply smiled and walked away, she began to cry, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived that afternoon with the medical unit, her Chinese-American features and gentle manner offering a bridge between cultures that the women desperately needed. She had volunteered for Pacific duty specifically to help civilian populations, driven by stories her own grandmother had told about the Japanese occupation of China. But even her medical training and cultural understanding hadn't prepared her for what she found in that compound. "They need immediate medical attention," she told Mitchell after her initial assessment, her professional calm barely masking her horror. "Severe malnutrition, untreated injuries, signs of systematic physical and sexual abuse, but they're terrified of being examined. They flinch when I approach, and several have tried to remove their clothes automatically, as if that's what's expected." "What do they need to feel safe?" Mitchell asked, genuinely wanting to understand how to help people who had forgotten what safety felt like. Dr. Chen considered this carefully, drawing on both her medical training and her intuitive understanding of trauma. "Time, patience, and proof that we're different from every other soldier they've encountered." That proof came in small gestures that seemed revolutionary to women who had learned to expect nothing but cruelty. When Mi Young flinched at Dr. Chen's approach, the nurse sat down several feet away and waited, speaking softly in Chinese and broken Korean, making no demands and offering no ultimatums. When Hana refused food, thinking it was a trap designed to make her compliant, Rodriguez left the rations nearby and walked away without demanding anything in return, without even waiting to see if she would take them. Most shocking to the women was the Americans' behavior around them. These soldiers, large foreign men with weapons and the authority of conquerors, kept their distance. They asked permission before entering rooms. They knocked on doors and waited for responses. They offered blankets and medical care without expecting anything in return, without even suggesting that gratitude might take a particular form. "Why aren't they touching us?" Mi Young whispered to Hana in Korean, her voice filled with confusion rather than relief. The older woman had no answer. In her experience, soldiers took what they wanted. These men seemed to want nothing except to help, and that was so far outside her understanding of how the world worked that she wondered if she was dreaming or if this was some elaborate form of psychological torture. 3 days after liberation, Mi Young spoke her first words to an American soldier. Dr. Chen was changing the bandages on her wrists, marks left by restraints that had held her during the worst moments, when Mi Young looked up with eyes that held the first spark of curiosity she'd shown and said in broken Japanese, "Why you kind?" Dr. Chen paused in her work, understanding the weight of the question, the way it contained within it all the horror and confusion of the past 2 years. Through Hiroshi, she explained carefully, because you're a human being, because you deserve kindness, because treating you well isn't something we do to get something back, it's something we do because it's right. The concept seemed foreign to Mi Young, as alien as the English words she was beginning to hear around the compound. For 2 years, her worth had been measured only by her usefulness to others, her value calculated in terms of what could be taken from her. The idea that she deserved kindness simply for existing, that her humanity was inherent rather than earned, was revolutionary in a way that made her head spin. Sergeant Mitchell found himself thinking about these women constantly, their faces haunting his quiet moments in a way that was different from the usual ghosts of war. In his letters home to his wife Mary, he struggled to explain what he'd witnessed without revealing classified information or burdening her with details that would give her nightmares. "Dear Mary," he wrote one evening by lamplight, "I've seen things here that make me understand why we fought this war in a way I never did before. There are people who needed saving, and I'm grateful we could be the ones to do it. When I come home, I'll be a different man than the one who left. I hope you'll still recognize the parts of me worth loving. I hope I can find a way to live with the parts that have been changed forever." As trust slowly built like a bridge constructed one careful plank at a time, the women began to share their stories. Mi Young had been taken from her village at 17, told she was being recruited for factory work in Japan that would help her family financially. Instead, she was transported to this compound and told her new role with the casual efficiency of someone assigning kitchen duties. "I tried to resist," she told Dr. Chen through Hiroshi, her voice barely above a whisper, her hands shaking as she remembered. "They said if I didn't cooperate, they would bring my younger sister here too. They showed me a list with her name on it. They knew where she went to school, what time she walked home. I couldn't let that happen to her." Hana's story was similar. False promises, systematic coercion, and the calculated destruction of any hope of escape. She had been told her parents had sold her to pay debts, a lie that had taken months to see through but had served its purpose of making her feel abandoned by everyone who should have protected her. The Chinese women, Liu Wei and Zhang Min, had been captured during the occupation of their city, rounded up with dozens of others, and sorted like livestock based on age and appearance. Each story revealed the calculated nature of the comfort women system, the way it had been designed not just to provide sexual services to soldiers, but to break the spirits of occupied populations. This wasn't random violence. It was organized, sanctioned, and designed to destroy hope as thoroughly as it destroyed bodies. The American soldiers listened to these accounts with growing horror and rage that they struggled to contain. Many had to step outside to compose themselves, to walk off the fury that threatened to overwhelm their professional composure. Private Rodriguez, who had 3 sisters back home, was found crying behind the supply truck after hearing Liu Wei's story about watching her younger sister being taken to a different facility. "How do we fix this?" he asked Mitchell, his voice raw with emotion. "How do we make this right? How do we give them back what was stolen?" Mitchell had no answer because there wasn't one. Some wounds were too deep for quick healing, some losses too profound for simple justice. Hiroshi Tanaka became more than just an interpreter. He became a bridge between worlds, a translator not just of language, but of concepts and cultures. Born in California to Japanese immigrants, he'd volunteered for military service to prove his loyalty to America after his family was interned, carrying his own burden of injustice and displacement. Now he found himself helping heal wounds created by the country of his ancestors, navigating the complex emotions of being both Japanese and American in a situation that highlighted the worst of one identity and the best of the other. "They ask me if all American soldiers are like you," he told Mitchell one evening as they sat outside the compound, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. "They can't understand why you don't take what you want. In their experience, power always takes from those who have no power to resist." "What do you tell them?" Mitchell asked, genuinely curious about how to bridge such a vast gap in understanding. "I tell them about America, about the idea that all people have rights regardless of their circumstances, about the belief that strength should protect weakness, not exploit it. It's a difficult concept for them to grasp after what they've experienced, but I can see them starting to believe it might be possible. The breakthrough came when Mi Young asked Dr. Chen to teach her English words. Not commands or please or the vocabulary of survival. Simple words like thank you and please and friend. Words that assumed a world where politeness mattered, where relationships could be built on mutual respect rather than fear. Friend, she repeated carefully, testing the foreign sounds on her tongue like she was tasting something new. You, friend? Dr. Chen smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in days. Yes, I'm your friend, and friends help each other without expecting anything in return. 2 weeks after liberation, as Dr. Chen was helping Mi Young with her English lessons in the makeshift classroom they'd set up, the young Korean woman asked the question that would haunt everyone who heard it, the question that would follow them home and change how they saw the world. Why are they so kind? She said in careful English, then repeated it in Korean for Hiroshi to translate fully, to make sure the depth of her confusion was understood. Dr. Chen set down her medical supplies and considered the question seriously, understanding that her answer might shape how this young woman saw humanity for the rest of her life. How do you explain human decency to someone who's had it systematically stripped away? How do you describe light to someone who's lived in darkness for so long, they've forgotten what colors look like? In America, she began slowly, choosing her words carefully, we believe that every person has value, not because of what they can do for others, not because of their usefulness or their beauty or their strength, but simply because they exist. We believe that treating people with kindness isn't a favor we do when we feel generous. It's a responsibility we all share, like breathing or eating. Mi Young listened intently as Hiroshi translated, her brow furrowed with the effort of understanding concepts that challenged everything she'd learned about how the world worked. But we are broken, she said, the English word feeling strange in her mouth. Used, damaged. Why value us? Because being hurt doesn't make you less valuable, Dr. Chen replied, her voice firm with conviction. Being victimized doesn't make you worthless. A flower that's been through a storm is still a flower. A person who's suffered is still a person, still deserving of respect and care and love. The conversation continued for hours, with other women gradually joining, drawn by the sound of voices discussing hope instead of survival. They struggled to understand a worldview where their suffering didn't define their worth, where kindness wasn't a transaction, where they could have value beyond their utility to others. Sergeant Mitchell, overhearing parts of the conversation, found himself examining his own beliefs in a way he never had before. He'd grown up in a small Ohio town where treating people decently was simply expected, where kindness was as natural as breathing. He'd never had to articulate why compassion mattered. It just did, the way the sky was blue and water was wet. But these women had lived in a world where kindness was weakness, where compassion was exploited, where trust was punished. Teaching them to believe in human goodness again would take more than words. It would take consistent action, daily proof that another way of living was possible. The American military, initially unprepared for this situation, quickly mobilized resources as word of the discovery spread up the chain of command. A proper medical facility was established, staffed with female nurses and doctors when possible. Counseling services, though primitive by modern standards, were provided through interpreters who struggled to translate concepts that had no equivalent in languages shaped by different cultural assumptions. Most importantly, the women were given choices, something they hadn't experienced in years. They could choose what to eat, when to sleep, whether to participate in activities. Small freedoms that most people took for granted became revolutionary acts of self-determination, each decision a step toward reclaiming their agency. Mi Young chose to help Dr. Chen with medical supplies, finding purpose in caring for others that reminded her of who she had been before the war. Hana, despite her trauma, became a mother figure to the younger women, helping them navigate their new reality with the wisdom of someone who had survived the unsurvivable. Liu Wei discovered a talent for drawing and began sketching portraits of the American soldiers who had saved them, trying to capture in pencil the kindness she saw in their faces. Not all choices were easy. Some women wanted to return home immediately, despite having no way to get there and no certainty of what they would find. Others were too ashamed to face their families, believing themselves permanently dishonored by what had been done to them. A few, like Jiang Min, had no families left to return to, their entire worlds erased by war. "What happens to us now?" Mi Young asked Dr. Chen one afternoon as they organized medical supplies together, the routine work providing a sense of normalcy that felt almost miraculous. "That's up to you," Dr. Chen replied, the words carrying weight that Mi Young was still learning to bear. "For the first time in years, your life is your own choice to make." The concept was both liberating and terrifying, like being told she could fly when she'd forgotten she had wings. As weeks passed, genuine relationships began to form between the rescued women and their liberators. Sergeant Mitchell found himself looking forward to his daily check-ins with the women, not as a military duty, but as visits with friends whose resilience amazed him daily. He taught Mi Young basic English phrases and learned Korean words in return, their conversations a mixture of languages and gestures that somehow conveyed more than words alone could manage. Private Rodriguez, who spoke some Chinese from his time in California, became Liu Wei's primary communication partner. Their conversations, conducted in a mixture of Chinese, Spanish, and elaborate gestures, often ended in laughter, a sound that had been absent from the compound for so long that it seemed to surprise even the women who made it. Dr. Chen became more than a medical provider. She became a confidant, a teacher, and for many of the women, the first person they'd trusted in years. Her own Chinese heritage helped her connect with Liu Wei and Jiang Min, while her American perspective offered hope for a different kind of life, a world where women could be doctors and soldiers and anything they chose to be. Even Akiko, the former Japanese overseer, found unexpected redemption in the chaos of liberation. Initially viewed with suspicion by both the Americans and the comfort women, she gradually proved her desire to make amends through actions rather than words. She helped with translation, shared information about the women's medical histories, and worked tirelessly to care for those she had once supervised under very different circumstances. "I cannot undo what I allowed to happen," she told Hiroshi in Japanese, her voice heavy with guilt that would follow her for the rest of her life. "But perhaps I can help heal some of the damage. Perhaps I can prove that people can change, that we can choose to be better than we were." As autumn approached, decisions had to be made about the women's futures. The American military couldn't house them indefinitely, and the women themselves were beginning to think about life beyond the compound, about the possibility of futures they had never dared to imagine. Mi Young faced the hardest choice of all. Her village in Korea was only a day's journey away, but she hadn't seen her family in over 2 years. Would they accept her back? Could she face their questions, their pity, their potential shame? Would they see her as the daughter they had lost, or as something else entirely? "I'm afraid," she admitted to Dr. Chen one evening, as they sat together watching the sunset. "What if they look at me and only see what was done to me? What if I can never be their daughter again, only a reminder of terrible things?" Dr. Chen took her hands gently, feeling the calluses and scars that told their own story. "Then you'll know they're not worthy of the strong, brave woman you've become. But I think you might be surprised by how much love can overcome, how much stronger family bonds are than shame." Sergeant Mitchell was facing his own difficult decision. Orders had come through for his unit to ship home, but he was reluctant to leave before ensuring the women's safety. He'd written to his congressman, to military chaplains, to anyone who might help establish a more permanent solution for women who had fallen through the cracks of official policy. "You can't save everyone, Sergeant," his commanding officer told him during their final briefing. "You've done more than most would, gone further than duty required." "But it doesn't feel like enough," Mitchell replied, the weight of incomplete rescue heavy on his shoulders. "How do we just leave them and go home to our normal lives?" 6 months after liberation, Mi Young stood at the gates of her family's village, her heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. Dr. Chen had given her a letter of introduction, written in Korean, explaining her circumstances without going into traumatic detail. She carried a small bag of belongings and a photograph of the American soldiers who had saved her, proof that kindness existed in the world. Her mother's face, when she saw her daughter approaching, went through a dozen emotions in seconds: shock, joy, grief, and finally, overwhelming love that swept away 2 years of uncertainty and fear. The embrace that followed lasted for minutes, with both women crying too hard to speak, holding each other as if they could make up for all the lost time through the strength of their grip. "My daughter," her mother whispered against her hair. "My precious daughter is home. Nothing else matters. Nothing else will ever matter." The village's reaction was mixed, as Mi Young had expected. Some whispered behind their hands, creating stories to fill in the gaps of what they didn't understand. Others offered quiet support, bringing food and small gifts that spoke of acceptance without requiring explanations. But her family's love proved stronger than shame, and gradually, she began to rebuild her life on the foundation of their unwavering support. She kept in touch with Dr. Chen through letters, practicing her English and sharing news of her recovery. She wrote about learning to sleep without nightmares, about the first time she laughed without feeling guilty, about the slow process of remembering who she had been before the war. She married a kind man who knew her story and loved her anyway, who understood that healing was a process rather than a destination. She had children, and told them about the American soldiers who taught her that kindness existed in the world, that people could choose to help rather than hurt. Sergeant Mitchell returned to Ohio a changed man, carrying with him the faces of women who had taught him about resilience and the power of small kindnesses. He spoke at churches and community groups about what he'd witnessed, becoming an early advocate for recognizing the comfort women's suffering long before it became historically fashionable. His marriage to Mary grew stronger as he learned to value the simple kindness of everyday life, to see the extraordinary in ordinary decency. Dr. Chen continued her military service, specializing in trauma care for civilian populations. She carried the lessons learned from the comfort women to other assignments, always remembering that healing required more than medical treatment. It required the restoration of human dignity, the patient rebuilding of trust in humanity's capacity for good. Years later, when historians began documenting the comfort women's system, they would find detailed records kept by Dr. Chen and testimonies collected by Sergeant Mitchell. These documents would become crucial evidence in understanding the scope and systematic nature of the atrocities, helping to ensure that the women's suffering was not forgotten or denied. But for the women themselves, the most important legacy wasn't historical. It was personal. They had learned that kindness existed, that they deserved respect, and that their suffering didn't define their worth. They had discovered that even in humanity's darkest moments, there were people who chose compassion over cruelty, who used their power to protect rather than exploit. Mi Young, now a grandmother with silver in her hair and laugh lines around her eyes, would often tell her grandchildren about the American soldiers who saved her. "They taught me," she would say, "that even in the darkest times, there are people who choose to be kind. And that kindness can heal wounds you thought would never stop hurting." When her grandchildren asked why the soldiers had been so kind, she would smile and repeat the answer Dr. Chen had given her so many years ago. Because every person has value, simply because they exist. And treating people with kindness isn't a favor. It's a responsibility we all share. The question that had once seemed impossible to answer, "Why are they so kind?" had become the foundation of her understanding of human nature. In a world that had shown her the worst of humanity, she had also discovered its best. And that discovery had made all the difference, not just in her life, but in the lives of everyone she touched with her story. In the end, the story of the comfort women's liberation wasn't just about the end of their suffering. It was about the beginning of their healing. And that healing had started with a simple act of human kindness from soldiers who understood that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The legacy of that kindness would ripple through generations, a reminder that even in humanity's darkest moments, the choice to be compassionate can light the way forward, that small acts of decency can restore faith in the possibility of goodness, and that sometimes the most powerful question isn't, "How could this happen?" but, "Why are they so kind?" What do you think about this incredible story of human kindness in the darkest of times? Have you ever experienced or witnessed acts of compassion that restored your faith in humanity? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective on how small acts of kindness can make such a profound difference. If this story moved you, and you'd like to see more untold historical accounts like this, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you never miss our latest videos. Your support helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, in a world that can sometimes seem dark, we all have the power to choose kindness.